Welcome back to the Equidemia podcast. My name is Celina Skogan, and I have been working for many years at the intersection of science and everyday horse practice with a clear stance, rethinking horse training, evidence-based and ethical. If you want to make good decisions for yourself and your horse, and that not out of habit or based on a good gut feeling, but grounded in deep understanding, then you are in the right place. This podcast is not exactly about quick fixes, as you might have found out by now, but it's all about context and connections and about the responsibility that comes with working with horses and understanding them better. And that is exactly why today we need to talk about something that is surprisingly often let out of conversation in the horse world, and that is domestication. Not as a historical footnote, but as something that still acts within the body of our horses today. I hope you enjoyed the episode as much as I did researching and making it, and then let's dive in and go a little bit deeper. And I also would like to tell you a little bit about my personal story and why I started to think about evidence-based at all, because usually there is a reason for what we are doing in our biography. So first of all, I would like to discuss with you or clarify with you when you are once having glasses, the trouble is starting. I would like to discuss with you what domestication is really, because domestication is very often confused with taming. So let's say a few sentences to that, because it is not the same thing. It's not about taming a wild animal, because taming is affecting the individual, the individ. So if you are going out into the mountains and you are catching a Mustang and then you are taming it, it is affecting that individual. But domestication, that is affecting the whole population, and it is affecting it across generations. In biology, domestication is describing a process in which humans consciously or unconsciously, I'm sorry, do you hear my dogs coming home? They just had a good walk. They are very nicely domesticated, because none of us would confuse a Chihuahua with a wolf. I mean, would you? So why are we doing that with horses? So let's have a look at that. My line of thought was actually going. So, because in biology, and that is something that we need to get clear in our mind, domestication describes a process in which humans consciously or unconsciously, but most often consciously, decide about which animals is reproducing and under which conditions and with which traits. Meaning we are doing a selection. And then it depends on what you're selecting for. But in general, you're always selecting on convenience for the human while you are handling. So usually the biggest selection topics or issues are behavior towards humans, stress responses. Of course, you are more likely to continue breeding with the bull, when we are thinking cows, that is not attacking you, than with the one that is chasing people over the field or that is attacking or killing people, right? I mean, that goes without saying. It's very logical once you think about it, but we don't think about it so often. Then we also have to think about which animal is at all willing to reproduce or can reproduce within a human-controlled environment. Because if you're remembering, for example, some zoos or animal parks, they are having these big breeding projects going, but they don't manage to get offspring. So they also need a certain resilience. Maybe let's call it resilience, that they are all willing to reproduce in this human-controlled environment. And the result of that, and that is where it's getting interesting, is not an adapted wild animal. It is eventually, after a few generations, a completely changed organism, genetically, developmentally, and also physiologically. So it has still 4 legs and a head and a tail, but the rest of it, that is not the same anymore. And also, as we see that, for example, with rewilding projects of animals that has been living for a long, long time in a human-controlled environment, it's not always going without saying. It's often very difficult. Let's put it differently. So, domestication doesn't describe what an animal can do, but it describes what it has become. And that is usually something that is more convenient for us humans, easier to handle, easier to reproduce, and nice to have around us. We will, in our next podcast, have a deeper look at how breeding is influencing that. Today, we are staying a little bit more with domestication. And let's think about horses, because this is a horse and rider podcast. So let's think about horses, because domestication is not a short-term process. And that is a moment where we need to ask the question, for how long are we actually domesticating horses? And that is interesting, because for dogs, we know more or less that dogs have accompanied humans for at least 15,000 years. For horses, we are looking at roughly 5,500 years of history, with massive intensification of breeding in a very short historical time frame. Especially in the last couple of centuries. So the last century especially was very, very intensive in terms of domestication. What is interesting here is that dogs and cats, for example, they have been deciding to live with humans, staying around humans, because they had an own benefit for it. So they simply, it was easy access to food. And it was a win-win situation. So first, dogs and cats were hanging around because human had this garbage heaps, this food garbage heaps, where they were hanging around it, where they had easy access to meals. And then they found out they even have easier access to meals when they are staying even closer to humans. And vice versa, humans had also their advantages, because the cats were taking care of the rats and mice, so less diseases in their environment. But also in dogs, for example, dogs have been very handy to protect the farm, for example, or to just give a note, give a feedback if there's an intruder coming. That's something that is extremely handy if you are living with your family alone in the countryside, for example. So let's say that was a win-win situation, or maybe even a win-win-win situation for all of them. I'm not sure if still all dog breeds are thinking that is a win-win situation, when we are thinking about the overbred dogs that are having this, noses and can't breathe anymore and stuff. But that is also a topic when for our next podcast, when we are thinking about genetics and too intensive breeding. So for today, we are looking at it from a different perspective. So horses, there we are just looking at these 5,500 years of use history. That is a much shorter time frame. Hence, the more intensification of breeding, and then, the narrowing down of the gene pool that has happened in the last century. But let's stay with the start of it, because the earliest evidence comes from the Butai culture. And that is very interesting, because that was not about riding. It was not about training or transportation at all at the start of the story in between human and horse. We simply kept horses for meat and milk production. But even then, it is comparably, it's much easier to have horses around you who are tolerating milking, for example. Of course, you don't breed on the horses that are hitting your head each time you are trying to milk it, right? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. What is important to understand let's stay with this with this moment of thinking. So we kept horses for milking, and we kept it for farming meat, having easy access to an additional food source. And then eventually people found out it is handy to transport things on horseback. Horses can carry quite well. And then they found out they can't only organize stuff on horseback, they can even ride it or get transported themselves. And this is here the crossroads where in the one end, and that is the road we are taking today, we can go into domestication and genetics eventually. And on the other hand, we could also look at it as the start of riding tradition, at the start of how was the seed developing and what and when and why. Mm. That is for another podcast. There's a very interesting book that I have on my desktop. Mm, maybe it will even get printed one day, but that's two completely different line of thoughts. And today we are staying with the domestication road, just for clarifying that are always you always have when you're thinking about evidence based, but also thinking about history, of course, you always have these crossroads where you're seeing, okay, that these decisions in between rideability, trainability, and then the domestication process or the breeding process overall, they have intersections. And I think that is very important to understand, also for not getting too scientifically and too evidence based. We are making a podcast, or we are having a platform for trainers and riders, and I think it is very important and very handy to have evidence as a solid foundation under the everyday training decisions or the everyday decisions, not only training decisions that we are taking around our horses. But we don't want to get scientists and we don't want to compete with scientists. We would like to pick a little on their brain and use their knowledge for having a nice and easy life together with our horses, as simple as that. And that is the reason why I'm always trying to, pinpoint these intersections where our riding tradition is connected with, in this context here, a domestication process. So, of course, at the latest, when people were not only eating the meat and not only milking the animals for an additional food source, easy accessible food. At the latest, when they started riding, there was another factor in the breeding selection, and that factor was that you simply were searching for which is the nicest horse to train, which horse is fitting well to the human body. So the more use cases you have for the animal, the more the selection is getting intensified. And I think that is also something that is important to understand, because suddenly you are, let's say, if you're part of a population, a human population that has a very small pelvis, then you're selecting for the horses with a smaller chest, because on the white ones you simply can't sit so comfortable. And when you are, what would be another example? If you are very tall, then you're selecting on big horses. And if you're very small, you're selecting on small horses, because this is what is more comfortable for you to get transported on. The more we are using an animal, the more effects on domestication it has, because the more we are, or the more and more we are selecting on certain traits. And sometimes it's difficult for us to oversee what the selection on this trait has as a long-term effect, as a long-term after effect coming after it, because it's not always very obvious. What is also important to understand is that our modern horses are not descendant linearly from the first domesticated horse. Would be nice if it is so, but it isn't. So genetic studies are showing that multiple domestication and interregression events must have happened, and that there was an event, we don't know what actually, something happened, that there was a very strong genetic restructuring, especially over the last 2000 years. We are linking you a very nice article from Nature. From Nature, Nature is a magazine that is discussing that beautifully from a scientific perspective. But this is still relevant today because domestication isn't finished. So once the horse is out from the mountains in the stable, domestication isn't finished. It continues to act in everybody we work with. But also we continue to breed, and with each generation of breeding, we are continuing domestication. And our modern horses are very highly selected, often bred within very narrow lines. And in our next podcast, we will have a look what that means actually for the horses. And they are shaped for use, performance, and especially availability. That means easy to train. And that's fair, and that's fair enough. But that is also where the question begins that eventually caught up with me personally. And maybe one or the other have heard about this here in the podcast before, but when my daughter was born, I bought 5 young horses. And I didn't do that, nah, young and young. One of them was already 8, but comparably young. And I didn't do that carelessly or uninformed. I mean, I was a professional rider already 5 years ago for a couple of decades or a bit more than a couple. You see, I have a little bit gray hair, so I'm not completely fresh anymore. I'm not in my teenage years. Yeah, so I already had a certain amount of career behind me. So it wasn't carelessly, it wasn't uninformed, it wasn't just because it had beautiful eyes. I planned, I invested time, money, knowledge, and of course also my heart. I bought them not from eBay Kleinanzeigen or Fin.no. I bought them from selected breeders that where I thought they know what they are doing. But none of these horses was fit for survival. And that is a sentence that makes me a little heavy around my heart. And it is, it's still doing also something with my breathing and something with my, of course, it is doing something with me because I like horses, but it is as dramatic as it sounds, and it has changed and challenged something in me fundamentally. So at the start, I thought if it were, when it was just one, I was a little unlucky. I thought this must be a coincidence. But then when I started to unravel the whole thing, I found out much deeper layers, and that was one of the reasons why I started to dig into genetic diseases and domestication and breeding on all that stuff around. Eventually ended up with primitive traits and primary traits and genetic variation and functional anatomy and stuff. So if you want to say so, I have profited from this unlucky event. But if I could choose, I would still like to believe that shoulder in is fixing all my problems and haven't endured these years of suffering of taking care of animals where you're trying to create some quality of life, though they are basically waiting for their death. So that's not very funny. Mm. And eventually I came to the point where we simply saw, it wasn't one, it wasn't two affected, it was all of them affected, very different breeds, very different, coming from very different corners of Europe. And that was the moment where I thought, okay, it can't be coincidence. So usually I have been buying young horses all my life. And usually you're doing that, especially as a professional rider, because you don't want anybody else touching them. You don't want them to get destroyed so early in their life. You want them to have enough space, enough movement. I had studied nutrition at that point in my life already. So I had an idea about, what does a youngster need for a good upbringing? What kind of management do I need? I was already a trainer in that moment in my life. I had been training a few horses, a few generations of horses. So I would dare to say, I am a quite good pedagogue. I have an idea about training planning and all that stuff. So I don't only know how to do it, how to explain something to my horse, but also the muscle physiology behind it and what the bones need and what the ligaments need and stuff. So we built them here, beautiful home, and still I had to look at all of them dying. And um, that was a really fundamental, it was a really fundamental cut into my belief system, into my life, in all of it around there. And I'm not sure if I finished the process. It has been starting inside me, because until that point I did not sufficiently understand what the genetic prerequisites that these bodies carry, how important that was. I have been thinking about training, housing systems, and all of that, even nutrition, even load carrying, loading capacity, and all that stuff. But I didn't understand how important the animals, so the forefathers, the mothers, the fathers of these animals, how important that was. At this point, when I was starting to train Tassilo, for example, my Frederiksborger, who turned out to have Wobbler syndrome, the only thing that I saw for a start was that he had difficulties after a couple of rounds to put weight on the left hind leg. And then I knew a lot of good training techniques for putting weight on these hind leg and for trying to train that up until I found out that the horse actually has Wobbler syndrome. So with wobblers, it doesn't matter anymore how well you're training. It doesn't matter anymore what you're feeding. It doesn't matter anymore. It's a challenge in between time, trying to control pain, trying to control the neurological deficiencies that the animal has. But it's not fit for survival. It will have to leave much too early, whatever you do. And of course, that has changed something in me. So, but at this point, it became very clear to me to say genetics it's not a side issue. It's not about color. It's not about how big or how small a horse is. It's also not a breeder's problem. It's not specialist knowledge. It's the foundation of physical integrity. It's a prerequisite for resilience and a framework for everything around it, and learning, adaptation, stress processing, but especially this prerequisite for resilience and the foundation of physical integrity. I don't want to say that every problem is genetic, but with bad genetics, you aren't fit for survival and there's nothing to train left. And at that point, Tassilo was the first of my youngsters that I had to put down. It was a deep cut into my heart. Because, of course, even if you see that the animal is not completely tippy-toppy, you're putting all your heart and all your soul in there. And I do understand, and that is why I'm burning. So here we are closing the cycle again. That is one of the reasons why I'm burning so much for functional gait analysis, because if you can do functional gait analysis, you can see, is this a good animal to breed with without doing a lot of genetical tests or x-rays or whatever. And you can see where's the load bearing capacity and so on. So I actually would wish that every veterinarian, every breeder, every rider, because only if we riders don't buy sick animals anymore, breeders need to change. But I also do believe that breeders usually love their animals with that they are breeding. They have a mission behind it. So I would wish that breeders would dive into it and learn about it and start to understand what is the importance of gait analysis also for breeding, also what genes are passed on. You can see neck abnormality on a movement pattern. You can see hindquarter instability, and so on and so on. So genetics is just so much more. And of course, this experience has fundamentally changed my work. And I have stopped, yeah, that sounds a little bit too simple if I'm saying I've stopped asking what am I doing wrong in training, because I think this is still for a rider and trainer a very important thing to reflect on. How am I training? How am I asking the horse to do something? But there's so much more out there than pedagogy. And I started asking, what are we structurally overlooking in our understanding of the horse itself? And that was one of the questions why the Academia Summit was born, or not the this year's Academia Summit. That's a better expression, because this year's summit is titled "Inside the Horse's Mind." And with my skill set or my knowledge of functional anatomy, I am a little bit alone in the world. So very often when I'm going to a veterinarian, or when I'm, going somewhere, they say, no, 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 the animal is healthy. There's nothing. But they don't see what I see. And sometimes we don't have the diagnostics, and sometimes we will first find an answer when the horse is on the dissection table. But what we can see is a very clear behavior. We can see, is the horse feeling happy or not? Is the horse, what's going on in this horse's life and mind? And why is the horse not asking, can I make this behavior go away? But why is the horse behaving like this? So the biological foundations are underlying everything that we see in training. It's reflecting on our training, reflecting back. And domestication is not a side topic here. It is the starting point. And yeah, that is why during the summit we are speaking a whole day about a lot of things around domestication. It's also something that is going like a red thread through all 4 summit days. And I really hope that you are coming and listening to it, because it's very important. It's very important to understand that. This episode has laid the foundation now, and in the next episode, we go to places where genetic processes have become visible. We are looking at foxes, at a very famous fox experiment. We are looking at wolves of the Isle of I never know if I should pronounce it French or English. I think it is the Ile Royale. Might also be the Isle Royale. Nobody knows exactly. But there was a group of wolves isolated on an island. We had a similar experiment here. There was a group of moscus, we say in Noshk, a group of bisons. Ah, cows, something like this. I'm sorry, I'm missing the English word. That was isolated on an island, and where scientists were looking at what happens over the generations. The wolves were very, very nicely and well tracked. There's a lot of papers about out there where we can read up on what happened to them. There were documented spinal and cervical abnormalities. So there we can have a look at genetics. When we are looking at the fox, we are having another look at at not abnormalities, but domestication processes. So, and that is very interesting, because then we can really start to understand how deeply genetics intervene into the body. And that if we want to talk about horse training, we also need to talk about everything inside the horse's mind, talk about domestication. It's not explaining us everything, but without understanding it, there is quite a lot that remains unintelligible. And I will also tell you a little bit more about the story of my own horses. If you want to go deeper, you will find these questions much deeper reflected in the Equidemia Summit from the 19th to the 22nd of March. All information you would like to have or not have, you find in the show notes. And in the next episodes, we discuss then when genetics become visible and what happens then. Thank you for listening tonight. I am wishing you a very beautiful weekend. And then I'm seeing you next week. Looking forward to it.